Welcome to Sidelined. We love sports, but what happens when we realize that there's a lot of ethical questions surrounding them? Enter Sidelined, a 4-episode series looking at various ethical issues around sports. I'm your host, Brian Lehman, and for the inaugural episode of Sidelined, I'm joined by Dr. Andrew Dunn to introduce the topic of sports ethics and the role media plays in how we interact with sports. We'll begin by letting Dr. Dunn introduce himself and his background.
My name's Andrew Dunn. I'm an associate professor here at ETSU. I am also the incoming chair for the Department of Media and Communication here at ETSU, and so I'll be chair in the fall. My background is in journalism. That's what I studied in college, and it's kind of how I got interested in media. I actually originally started out as a biology major, and I decided I didn't really want to take calculus, and I didn't really see myself hunched over a microscope the rest of my life. So I switched over to the other thing that I knew how to do, which was write. Looked around for majors where I could write and get paid, and journalism popped up. And so we didn't have journalism, though. Similar to what we have here, we had media and communication, which opened the door to lots of other areas, lots of other fields. As an undergrad, I studied theory, I studied research methods, I studied, ethical considerations and things like that, which really piqued my interest. I went on to graduate school at Florida State, did my master's there in new and interactive technology. So I saw the way we were moving away from analog into digital, and I saw that progression not only with journalism, of course, but with all forms of media. When I did my radio stuff as an undergrad, we were doing tape, like reel, like old school stuff, potting up, potting down kind of stuff. And then, video was literally video on film and tape. And then we switched over to the digital world, and, dark rooms and photography kind of all went digital, and everything kind of changed. So I saw the whole industry, and I mean the whole industry, from journalism, TV, radio, everything changed. And that got me interested in new and interactive technology and the internet, and the kind of idea what the internet could provide. And then I continued working for newspapers. I worked for a couple of papers in Florida, the Tallahassee Democrat and the Ledger in Lakeland, Florida. And then I went back to school at Alabama, got my PhD, and focused really on kind of the area we call media psychology, understanding how media affects us psychologically and affects us both as individuals and as members of groups in society. But I've always had an interest in sports as well, mostly as a fan. I love all sports. I've got, my favorite teams of literally every sport out there. I'm a big fan of Tampa teams. So it's been a really good year for me. Watching the Lightning win the Stanley Cup, watching the Rays win the pennant. Didn't go all the way, but came close. And then watching the Bucks win the Super Bowl was just it's just, amazing year. And then I'm also went to Alabama for my PhD, and so I'm a big Bama fan. I grew up in Dothan, Alabama, so watching them win the national championship, huge deal. I've done a little bit of coverage of football, a little bit of, I went to Manchester, England, and covered a boxing match ringside in Manchester, which was pretty wild. Manchester City happens to be my favorite English Premier soccer football team for your European fans out there. And they're having a great year. So, I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan of that. But it's weird because I started teaching ethics, pretty early on, and I've been teaching ethics and law for a really long time. It's two of the classes that I probably taught the longest in some way or fashion. I've taught at Florida Southern, a small college in Lakeland, Florida. I've taught at Alabama, and I've taught here, and I've taught law and ethics in a lot of those places. And I've taught law and ethics pretty much since the day I got here at ETSU. It's a vital class for all students in media and communication. So, you got to know how you don't get sued and things like that. But also, you violate some of these rules that are oftentimes unwritten rules, find yourself out of a job. And as I always say, you can find yourself out of a career. So it's important stuff. So yeah, I got a lot of interest, a lot of different backgrounds, but yeah, I'm a huge sports fan.
Next, I asked Dr. Dunn about his thoughts on ethical issues in sports, specifically mentioning how sports has intersected with politics.
I mean, that's kind of always been the case, right? That politics and sports have always been an intersection, right? If we think all the way back to, Rome, everybody went to the Colosseum. Everybody was involved in the sport there. Of course, a lot of that was a blood sport, but there was a lot of politics involved, I mean, in the Romans, if they didn't like you, you ended up in the Colosseum, right? And if they didn't like you, it was probably because of your politics or your religion or, whatever. You were oftentimes part of the sport. And so, and even further beyond that, I mean, the two things that ancient Greece loved, were politics and sport, right? I mean, it's why we have the Olympics, and it's also why we have our kind of understanding of more modern ideas behind democracy and things like that. So you really can't separate the two. You go all the way back to ancient history and you see this collision, this relationship between sport and politics. So today's, debates on sport and politics are really not that much different than what we've always had. It's a different topic, going to be how much patriotism or / jingoism are we pushing into sports? How should we treat athletes? There that camp that said, athletes should just shut up and play. And then there are camps that, look, you are a pervasive member of society, you're a public figure, and you have a responsibility to speak up on political issues and to get people motivated to take interest in politics. And none of that's new, right? If you study both the history of politics and the history of sports, there's always been this connection there. Everybody gathers around the big fight. Everybody gathers around the big game, and politicians are almost always part of that gathering. There's almost always a politician that's got to say something about it, and when sports teams win Super Bowls and national championships, they come to the White House. It's a very long connection here in the United States and across the world with sports and politics. And so I don't really find anything that unusual about it. And it's really, if you look at history, it's not surprising in the least bit.
Here I reference the book Loving Sports When They Don't Love You Back by Jessica Luther and Kavitha Davidson, citing Dr. Susan K. Whitbourne's comments about how sports become a part of our identity, which can make it difficult to accept their faults.
Right. Well, and that's part of cognitive dissonance, which, we talked about in class, right? It's the idea that we like for the things that we think and do to be in line with each other. And when they're not, it causes us this dissonance, this uncomfortable feeling, right? So the example I often use, actually, I use a lot of sports examples, but one of the things I often use about cognitive dissonance is to just look at what happened after Penn State fired Joe Paterno. This legacy, this legend of college football coaching. But then there was this, huge scandal that there was likelihood that he, had an idea that there was, molestation going on with one of his coaches and young boys. And the school found out, and, it was huge controversy. And so, the school really didn't have a choice. They had to get rid of Joe Paterno. Like, he had to go. It was this time, probably should have gone, years before. But it was definitely at this time, you can't stay with that, right? He was one of your coaches. There was some inkling that something was going on. You look the other way and you had to go. Whether he knew the full extent, whether he knew, didn't matter. He had to go. And so when they fired him, the campus erupted. I mean, there was, practically a riot on campus. Why? Well, the student body who wore Joe Paterno masks to the games, who, took pictures of the Joe Paterno statues, are experiencing this extreme cognitive dissonance. Like, I'm supposed to love my coach. I'm supposed to love Joe Paterno. I'm supposed to love this guy. He's such a legend. And now I found out these terrible things about him, and the school's doing this terrible thing to him. And now I don't know how I'm supposed to feel, but I know I don't feel good. I'm going to go flip over a car or, whatever, right? That's where we see this this intersection of people not being able to handle the idea that your most favorite athlete, your most favorite coach, your most favorite sports figure may not be the person that you think that they are. And ultimately, if you put them on the pedestal, they may suddenly let you down. But at the same time, I look at some sports figures that I think deserve quite a bit of admiration, and they just get dogged left and right. And oftentimes it's because either they're doing something political and people feel like they shouldn't do anything political, or they're just really good and they consistently beat your team day in, day out, week in, week out, year in, year out, right? So one of the ones I always think about is LeBron James. Like, legitimately, LeBron James is one of the greatest basketball players of all time, period. You can argue, Jordan was better because he has more rings, or, if you want to talk about that, then we can talk about Bill Russell and we can talk about Kareem, but I'm not going to go down that road. My point is, he's arguably at least one of the best of all time. But man, he gets dogged. He gets dogged because he takes a political stance. He gets dogged because he, is really good, and ESPN talks about him a lot because he's good, because his team wins, because teams oftentimes win when he's on there. But, he also does a lot of philanthropy. He does a lot of giving back to the community. A lot of people didn't like him because he didn't go to college. He just, he bypassed that, went straight to the, there's always reasons why not to like. And it's like, meanwhile, right, you can have guys that, collect paycheck after paycheck, do nothing for the community, say nothing for the community, and are still beloved. And so it's a hard thing to figure out sometimes, and why people feel the way they do, and people looking the other way when players are doing something that they shouldn't be doing, and saying, well, but he's still my quarterback, or he's still my coach, or he's still my thing. And, it leads to, again, just a lot of mixed emotions, and a lot of hurt feelings, and a lot of ups and downs. But I think that's also part of the reason why we like sports, is it's an interesting story in addition to being this thing that we get all caught up in passion and regionalism and sectionalism and all this stuff.
Next, I asked Dr. Dunn if there's an ethical issue that has stood out to him and why.
I think, of course, I don't want to beat around the bush. I think we're going to talk about, whether or not athletes should kneel and whatnot in the games. We have seen this become a very iconic thing in sports, though. Take a little trip in history back to the 1968 Olympics. Two guys, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, who are on the stands getting their medals, and they throw up two black glove fists in the air, and America reacted, right? And you had the exact same kind of arguments going on, like, how dare they take their moment and speak out on politics. But what is a better time to speak out than right at that moment, right? What is a better time to say something than at that moment when all eyes are on you, right? And so this is not a new thing. And by the way, that wasn't the only political statement that was being made at the time, right? You also had a situation where, like, George Foreman won his bout in the Olympics and pulls out a little mini American flag and starts waving it around in the opposite direction, if you will, in terms of politics. Again, this is not new. And if we want to talk about, whether or not athletes should speak out, I don't think we should ever be in the business of telling people how they should and should not be political. That's kind of the First Amendment, right? Congress shall make no law, right? Bridging freedoms of speech, right? And so this idea of, shut up and play ball is just, to me, antithetical to what the United States and America stands for. The idea that we're a country built on free speech. And specifically when we talk about things like what goes on with students and when students get involved, and of course ETSU's had this issue come up as well. people have this idea, well, we should stop them. Well, I definitely don't think we should stop them, number one. But number two, you can't stop them. The law is very clear on this. The Supreme Court has been clear on this time and time and time again. If you want to specifically cite some cases, West Virginia Board of Education versus Barnett in 1943 clearly states that no school can force any student to participate in any patriotic demonstration. At that time, it was saluting the flag and doing the Pledge of Allegiance. And there were two Jehovah's Witness students in a classroom who were being compelled and were expelled because they didn't participate. And the Supreme Court voted 6-3 that the students are right in this case. Like, they had a reason not to participate. And if you know anything about Jehovah's Witnesses religion, you know that is one of their beliefs is to not participate in overt signs of patriotism, as it seems to elevate patriotism over faith in God, and again, just doesn't work well with their religion. And for a school to force a kid to do that is, not proper. And the Supreme Court made, it pretty clear that's how it felt on that matter. This is what Justice Douglas and Black, in their opinion on this, actually had this quote. Words uttered under coercion are proof of loyalty to nothing but self-interest. Love of country must spring from the willing hearts and free minds, inspired by a fair administration of wise laws enacted by people's elected representatives within the bounds of express constitutional prohibitions. But that idea, words must spring from willing hearts and of free minds. If you're compelled, it's not free. If you're made to do it, it's not free. Now, we've got a lot of other cases that deal with this. Tinker versus Des Moines is a case that I talk about in my class. Tinker and her classmates put on black armbands, went to school, got in trouble, got suspended for wearing these black armbands in school. Once again, Supreme Court says, look, students don't lose their free speech as soon as they hit the schoolhouse gate, right? It's not like they're not allowed to have freedom of expression. They are allowed to have freedom of expression, including wearing armbands or doing symbolic things in the name of free speech. And as long as it doesn't, interrupt the class or the learning environment or causes some kind of danger or harm to students, generally speaking, it's okay. And that's why I keep telling people over and over, we're all okay with free speech until we don't agree with it. And that's what it boils down to. It's everybody's okay with free speech until you don't agree with it. And then everybody's got to get hot and bothered about, we need to stop this. Well, you don't really need to stop this. That's what free speech looks like. So, yeah, is this an ethical issue? To me, it's more of a legal issue. There's no legal issue here. It is decided. And you can look at the Supreme Court cases that have dealt with this time and time again, and overwhelmingly, it is in the favor of the speaker. And in this case, that would be the kneeler. But is that the only ethical issue that we got going on in sports? No, not even remotely. There are all kinds of other ethical, suggestions. How we treat players is an ethical consideration. The idea that you're drafted to a team and you got to play for that team, and it's a crazy concept, right? Imagine you get your degree from ETSU, and then you enter this market, and maybe you get picked up, maybe not, but you have really no say in where you go. So you end up in some place where maybe you have no interest in being, right? I'm not going to pick on any particular team or any particular city, but there are cities I would rather go than other cities. You want to draft me to Tampa, I'm there tomorrow, right? You want to draft me to somewhere else, maybe not. But they don't have any say in that. That's an ethical consideration. Should they have more say in that? And certainly some players are starting to say, hey, I feel like I should be there. We also have the ethical consideration of what do we do with players who've been accused of terrible crimes, but not actually convicted, or in some cases it's a civil matter and not a criminal matter. Deshaun Watson right now is facing some issues with that, right? And people come forward and accused him of sexual abuse, sexual harassment. But it's civil matters and not criminal matters. There's no police involved, not going to jail over it. What do you do that? What do you do with that player? Do you keep them on the team? Do you get rid of them? Do we decide that, what's best for the team is to move on, or do we say what's best for the team is to keep them on and hope it doesn't get worse, or all kinds of stuff like that. We also have the issue of how women are treated in sports, right? Paid significantly less than men, even when they are clearly much better at the sport. Soccer being a perfect example. How many World Cups and gold medals and stuff is women's soccer won versus men's soccer, right? I mean, it's not even a discussion. It's ridiculous. But look at the money that's being paid, right? Also, the manner in which we talk about and treat women athletes is concerning. Should women be involved in contact sports, right? And I think we're making some good ground there. We've seen a kicker being put on a major team this year. We've seen 2 women coaches for the Tampa Bay Bucks, go Bucks, win a Super Bowl, right? So there's still a lot of, areas where we feel like, I don't know if we can talk about it. Well, we should talk about this. We should talk about these things, and we should be a lot more open to talking about these things rather than just sticking our heads in the sand. The issue of, Black ownership and Black leadership in the NBA, in the NFL, in literally all sports is a continual issue and one that deserves a lot more discussion. What do we do with sports that involve brain injuries, players that are suffering serious, debilitating brain injuries after playing and after retiring, and sometimes during it? That we start seeing these early signs of CTE in football players pretty early on in some cases. What do we do with that? Should we stop football altogether? What do we do with kids? Should we let them play football or not? There are all kinds of ethical considerations. Should we even be, enjoying sports that involve violence, like boxing, like the UFC, like football? There's an endless number of ethical considerations and ethical debates in sports. Each one of those comes with it a decision that has to be made. What do we do, and how do we address it? How do we go about it? And none of those are easy decisions, but they're decisions that need to be made, and they're decisions that need to have a lot of thought put into them.
Let's bring the media into this. How does the media affect some of these issues that you've just talked about in the context of ethics in sports, and how does media affect ethical issues? Maybe you can think of a few examples throughout history where media played a role.
Sure. I mean, first off, the media is, sports is media. I mean, that's the first thing, we have to say is that sports is media. How do you have sports without media? Right? I mean, unless you go to the game itself, you're sitting at home on TV, on the couch watching a TV, right? So sports is media, and sports magazines, sports newspapers, sports TV shows, sports stream podcasts, it's all media, man. Sports is media. You can't separate the two, really. But the way in which media can highlight, the way in which media can drive points home, the way in which media can resonate with people, the way in which media is consumed, the way in which media is curated, it definitely has an effect on sports. The fact that I bring up the 1968 Olympics is because of that jarring image that you see of two powerful athletes with 2 black fists in the air, and everybody knows that image. Everybody knows it. Everybody, right? That's the, a picture is worth 1,000 words kind of situation. And now think about just the universe of images and moments in time that have been captured by media in sports, and how much they played. Whether it's Lou Garrett, in his retirement speech, or most recently watching Tom Brady throw the Lombardi Trophy across the bay. I mean, there's so many of these images that now get burned into our brain, and so we latch onto those. And when we see these really jarring images, whether it be LeBron's T-shirts with statements on it, or it's the latest news story about somebody getting arrested for, spousal abuse or something like that in the NFL. We latch on to those stories and we talk about them and we debate them, and they become the fodder for all the talking heads the next day. Stephen A. Smith's going to have something to say about it. Max Kellerman's going to have something to say about it. And we just spend the next day reliving it, dissecting it, talking about it. And of course, that pushes, a lot with that. And so, we talk about framing and how the media frames certain stories and how we talk about certain stories. And in the manner in which we, the media, talk about these stories, oftentimes will shape the way people see those stories, right? And so if I am Skip Bayless raging about, some new thing that's made him angry, then he's shaping the way his listeners think about that issue, or if I'm some other sports announcer and I'm, downplaying an event like this isn't a big deal, I'm again shaping my listeners and the way they think about this. We're not all powerful, obviously, and we know that there are limitations to what media have, but we do have some influence there. And I think that's, noteworthy. And when it comes to ethical issues, the same thing, you're going to have some people that are going to be all upset and want to, bash players for taking political stances. And you're going to have some people who are all for it and saying, this is what you should be doing. And then you're going to have some people that are saying, well, I'm going to avoid talking about it. And I'm just going to talk about what goes on the field. To me, that's a bit of a cop-out for the media to just say, well, we're just going to talk about what happens on the field. We're not going to talk about those other issues. That's not full coverage of sports. Sports goes beyond what happens on the field, right? There's a whole reason why ESPN has a show called Outside the Lines. Yeah. So yeah, I think media, I don't think you can separate the media from sports. It's impossible.
Right. Let's expand on the idea of how media, frames things and how it influences how we perceive sports and ethical issues around sports, how it can be a catalyst or an inhibitor for change, or how it can force people to think about things that maybe they wouldn't otherwise, or it can be a means of censorship.
Sure.
Let's talk about that a little bit.
I think the idea that the talking head sports has become a very much a talking head space. So we tune into ESPN and Fox and these Fox Sports and NBC Sports, and we tune into these things. And we listen to the talking heads go over what we all just witnessed, right? Whether it be, the Super Bowl or it be, a political situation. And we all just sit back and listen to what people have to say. And as a result of that, it may not completely shape the way we think about it, because we're going to talk to our, it's a two-step flow, right? We're going to hear that, and then we're going to go talk to our friends and our, neighbors and our other sports fans, or even better, you're talking to people who are not fans of your team. And then, then they're saying, you only won because of this or whatever. And it reshapes what you think. There's a process that goes on there. It's never like you're listening to a sports talking head and immediately agree with everything they say. But, you're going to pick up some things and go, I didn't think about it that way. And now I'm thinking about it that way. And, maybe that guy's right. Maybe it was this, maybe it was that. And so at least pushes the needle a little bit with us. And I think that is interesting. But I think also that people bring a lot of their own baggage to the table, right? Everybody brings their own politics to the table. Everybody brings their own, their own backgrounds to the table. And that we can't discount that either, because that's also going to play a role in it. It could be your demographics, your race, your gender, where you live in the country, and of course, as we've already mentioned, your politics, right? Now, all those things are going to bear weight on how you feel about any issue, including sports and ethical issues in sports.
I really appreciate you talking about this. Is there any other comments or anything that stands out about how media and sports and ethics intersect that you'd like to comment on before we wrap up?
I would say probably not, but I think, like I said, there's just an unlimited, route, a number of ethical issues and things that could be debated with sports. And even today I was I would not say arguing. I was taking exception to somebody who was suggesting that, sports are silly and that sort of thing. And And sure, if you sit down and think about it, sports it's silly. It's entertainment. It's nothing more than people playing a game, and we get excited about that. But there is more to it than that. It is more than just silliness. There is the politics. There are the ethical debates. There are the great, struggle, the conflict between one side and another side. There is the pride and the regionalism that comes with it. And then there's also the debates on whether or not these things are good things or bad things. Team sports, individual sports, they all have, a lot to debate about. It's an ambitious topic. There's a lot to talk about.
Let me ask you this. How is your profession in studies and media? Has it affected or changed how you look at sports and ethical issues involving sports?
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Okay. So one of the things that I do think about a lot is the difference in how we talk about the serious issues versus the fun stuff, right? And I actually worked with a graduate student to do his thesis on this topic of brain injury in football. And one of the things that we know is that the way a player talks about his or her injury may be very different from the way a coach talks about his or her injury, right? And depending on who the media picks to choose to tell that story can shape maybe the way people see that injury. If you ask the coach, he got a little concussion, it's all good. You ask the player says, yeah, I got a concussion, like that worries me. I know what could happen if I keep getting these concussions. It's a very, very different way of talking about that. And so I know that the way we talk about things can have an effect, but it also means that I think about these things in lots of different ways, because I also have a son. I love sports. My son, he likes to watch football with me. He's only 2, so he doesn't, he just knows that we're having fun. But then I have to think about, like, if I'm a big football fan, what does that mean for my son? And do I tell him to go ahead and play football, or do I try to push him into a different sport? Do I tell him not to play sports at all? Again, it's a struggle I think for a lot of us who are in the industry, know what happens, and then are sports fans ourselves, even when we know maybe we shouldn't be sports fans. I've been traditionally a big boxing fan for most of my life. And one of the things I love about boxing is there is such a interesting story of the guys that step into the ring. There's an interesting backstory to every single one of them. Some of them come from really impoverished, hard backgrounds. Some of them have, lives and careers before they even step in that ring. Some of them are fathers, and some of them, bring the weight of the world on them when they step in that ring. And that's fascinating to me. But I also know the human toll that boxing takes on fighters, and we see that. And it's usually not something that we see immediate. But we can see it happening with what we saw with Ali. We can see it happen with, guys that really struggle, like Gotti and people like that the brain injuries, the things that happened to them probably contributed to some of the awful things that took place later. And then we see the guys who were contenders, and then they fall out, and then, they fall into drugs, or they fall into, other problems. It's all this tapestry of humanity that goes into that. But at some point I felt like, I don't know if I can be with this anymore. I don't know if I can get with this sport anymore, because there's so much corruption, there's so much health issues, there's so many terrible things that can go on in that sport. And so I haven't really been I still watch it every now and then, but I haven't been as big of a fan of it as I used to be. I'm not as much of a follower. And I think a lot of it has to do with the kind of conversations that we're having right now. If we can figure out a way to solve some of these CTE issues in football and stuff like that, then I don't think fans will have as much problem with it. But I also am not sure that fans are really caring as much as they probably should, because they continue to just rake in the money, right? And the ratings, and people are still watching, and people are still buying tickets and buying swag and buying all kinds of stuff, right? And so I don't know how much deep thinking is going on with the issues that are here. So I don't know. It's something that, as a professional, I know a little bit about it. As a fan, I know a little bit about it. As a father, I know a little bit about it, and I still waffle on all three levels. I still have to think about this on all three levels.
I'm glad you said that about maybe not thinking about things and maybe needing to think about things, and specifically about brain injuries, because that's kind of the what I'm wanting to accomplish with this podcast, is just try to get people thinking about these things. The CTE issue with football is something that I've struggled to cope with recently, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on how you cope with it, how we watch sports, because brain injuries are just different. Like if somebody busts their leg, you can get you're a millionaire, you have insurance, you can get surgery, you'll be fine, but you don't recover from brain injuries. That affects you, that affects your family, that affects your lifespan and the
Of course,
decision.
I would offer you'd want to talk to some of these former players, even the ones that don't have CTE, about those physical issues, because some of them are hobbled, right? I mean, the older they get, the harder it is to move around, the harder it is to daily, do their daily tasks, and then we look at the pain management that current players are dealing with, right? And that's been one of the big issues of whether or not we should allow football players to, use medicinal marijuana or not, and or just straight up smoke weed to deal with some of their pain issues. There's a lot of debate on that. Should we allow, federally, marijuana is still considered an illegal substance. Should we look the other way if these guys come back with a positive screen for marijuana because they're smoking weed to deal with the pain management that they're going through right now? I mean, I don't think the average person understands how much a toll playing a professional sport like football, like a contact sport, has on the body throughout the year, but also continues after they retire. And you can have all the insurance in the world, but you can't remake your body, right? We're not the $6 million man. We can't be rebuilt better than we were before. It just goes downhill from the day you retire. It just goes downhill. And of course, we know with men and biological factors with male bodies and how they do deteriorate at a fairly fast rate at some point, which is why Brady's thing is so phenomenal. And we just never seen anybody play at that age, at that caliber for so long. But beyond the CTEs, we are watching guys destroy their bodies for this game, both mentally and physically. And what does that say about us?
Right.
But I don't, I invite people to think about that same thing with other sports, professional wrestling. If you're a pro wrestling fan and you like the comic book lifestyle of the pro wrestler, I get that. But on the other end, there's a lot of tragedy there. It's a lot of the same issues. It's a lot of the same CTE issues, a lot of the same physicality issues. And of course, the one thing we haven't talked about is steroid use, right? Performance enhancing. We have had a lot of really well thought of athletes turn up to have been juicing the whole time. I mean, think about the home run race, Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa and Barry Bonds. And, we think about possibly the greatest pedestal knockdown, greatest fall from grace we've ever seen with Lance Armstrong. I mean, this guy was the American hero. We put him on the highest of pedestals. I mean, the guy won the Tour de France and multiple times more than anybody. And we're just like, this is so like, it's just not real. It cannot be real. And we find out that it wasn't real, And so what do you tell a generation of kids that grew up fanboying over Lance Armstrong that, hey, kid, I'm sorry, but Lance is a fraud. It's all chemical production and it's fraud. And that's a hard conversation to have. And then you have to rethink, why am I into this? And again, it goes back to, I struggle with this. I love sports, but at the same time, I know that there are some really, really shady stuff that happens in sports. And I have to think to myself, maybe I shouldn't be a sports fan. I don't know. It's a tough one. And it's one I think will be an eternal struggle for those of us who do want to think deeply. The sad thing is that's oftentimes what sports is supposed to be. I think a lot of those people who are saying shut up and play are the people who don't want to think about these things. They don't want to think deeply about it. They just want to watch They just want to take 3 or 4 hours out of their life and lose themselves in a ball game and hopefully get that little spike of joy at the end if they win, right? And that little spark of joy if they lose, that little spark of, well, there's always the next game. There's always the next match. There's always next season. But I think it's worthwhile to think about these issues on a deeper level and to think about what it means and how can we help? Right. And that's really where, these conversations should lead is how can we help? What can we do next? How do we make football okay for my son to play and to be engaged in? How do we make sure that we don't have another false idol like Lance Armstrong? How do we make sure that women like Serena and Venus Williams are celebrated as much as the LeBrons and the Kobes and the Jordans? Like, how do we do that? I think those are worthwhile questions, and maybe even more important than the why we like this stuff and how do we make it better.
I mean, that's why we're talking about this. We love sports, but we look at the things involved in it, like you've been saying, and we have to say at what cost? At what point is it irresponsible? At what point is it? I cut myself off from football over the like middle of last season because I'm like it just felt irresponsible to me to endorse a sport that punishes people's bodies like this and rips them up for entertainment. And I mean, this goes across all ethical issues. Athletes are entertainers, sure, but they're people, and we have to consider how we treat people. That's kind of like part of what's at the heart of ethics. How do we treat people? So I really appreciate your thoughts on these things. And I mean, there's ethical issues, I guess, in every sport, every aspect of life. Maybe some stand out a little bit more. Maybe some have bigger consequences than others. But these are things that I think my hope is that this podcast will cause people to think more deeply about them. And I thank you for being a part of that. I think this has been a great introductory episode to help people think about these things more deeply.
I agree. I think it's a good thing to, sit and think about and to work through. And I think, the questions for athletes are going to be even more interesting, right? Mm. Why do you do it? And, who has the right to tell you to stop it?
Right.
Just because you and I might be squeamish about it, maybe they're not. I don't know.
And maybe that's the justification for some. It's like, oh, well, it's their choice. They decide to do it.
Absolutely. And that's the people love saying that. Well, it's their choice. I mean, does that make it okay? I don't know.
You hear about, I don't know, when the draft comes around, you hear all these stories about people living in one-parent homes and poverty, and sports was their escape, and they became really good at it, and that's how they get their family out of poverty, and that's how they help their family out. And so if you talk to a football player in the NFL and you say, hey, you shouldn't be playing this sport because it's bad for your body, that's how they take care of their family.
Right.
And it just becomes these really hard things of how do you make their source of income and our source of entertainment something that's good for everybody involved.
Yeah, good questions. I don't know.
Yeah.
So we'll see. Maybe that's another big consideration is, if there are more discussions like this and there are more fans that are feeling this conflictedness or confliction, I guess you and I feel about this, then what does that mean for the American sporting world? Do we suddenly see a sea change and, NFL falls out of favor and we promote other sports like basketball where we don't see the brain injuries as much? But then, again, you've got the same kind of issues of, the body can only take so much and, how many shots of lidocaine can someone have? And one time, what we do if we find out that, players are juicing there as well. And, it's just, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see. I'll look forward to hearing what everybody else has to say.
Thank you for listening. Be sure to check out the next episode where I virtually sit down with Jessica Luther and Kavitha Davidson. They authored the sports ethics book, Loving Sports When They Don't Love You Back, which has been a main resource in producing this podcast. Until next time, let's all consider how we and the sports we love treat people.